even get to bronze.
Alright, so welcome to the last section here of the first unit on functions. So this is section 1.4, inverses. So we're going to do some inverses today. What are the purposes? So we're going to sketch inverse functions, give you a graph, you inverse it. We're going to also figure out the equation of an inverse, give you an equation, you make the inverse of that. And again, practice ordering of transformations and practice mapping. You've seen this, you're going to see it over and over and over and over and over again, and maybe I'll stop putting this in the purpose, but for now we'll keep that in there. So here's a function. We want to sketch the inverse of this function. So in order to do that, we are going to map each of these points. So there's 4 points in this graph. We're going to map each of those. Note, to do this, it's really simple. You just flip your x and y values. So we take a point that's on f of x, 0.34, switch them. Take the next point, 2, 4, you switch the x and the y. You take the next one, you just flip the x and the y, and then you plot them. Easy as that. So inverses, not too tricky. You just take the points that are on there, switch the x and y, and then plot it. So that's what the inverse looks like. One thing I don't have on the graph here, you know how reflections vertically, you're reflecting over the x-axis, and then horizontal reflections, you're reflecting over the vertical axis. For inverses, you're reflecting over the y equals x-axis. So I didn't put this in the slide, but just as an extra tip, you'll notice with this graph here, there's a mirror. If you kind of put a line in the center like this, then you'll see that there's a mirror in there. Just an extra thing to help double check your answer, but you should be able to see something like that. Also with this, notice what happens when I talk about domain and range. So let's look at f of x. If we look at the domain, I go from -5 to +3. And for the y's, I go from -1 up to 4. If we look at g of x, domain is from -1 to 4. And your range is from -5 down at the bottom up to 3. So look what happened to my domain and range. I just switched them. The domain of my f of x now becomes the range of my g of x. The range of my f of x now becomes domain. So you'll notice that inverse functions, they've got a lot of just you flip the x's and the y's. It's going to become a common theme. We did that with the points. You flip them. Domain and range, you flip them. And getting into the next part with the equations, we're going to do the same thing. So if I want to figure out the equation of an inverse, switch the x and y. Again, you're inversing them. You're going to switch the two of them. Second thing, you solve for y with those equations. And then the third step, celebrate how easy that was. That's all you're doing. Inverses really is not too tricky. So if we look at an example here, y equals 4x plus 7. So first step, switch the x and the y. So I just took the y, changed it to an x, took the x, changed it to a y, and then we're going to solve for y. So subtract the 7 on both sides, divide by 4. There you go. That's how easy it was. So you can pause the video and celebrate how you feel like it if you so desire. I'm not going to do it. That's embarrassing. So next one, let's try another example. So depending on the equation, it can vary in a little bit of difficulty solving for y, but still the process is very straightforward. So let's take this equation here. Now we've got a quadratic. So first step, switch the x and the y, and now we just need to solve for y. So I'm going to subtract 5, divide by 4. You'll get something like this. You're going to take the square root. Remember, when you take the square root, you need to put the plus or minus. This is going to become very important, especially when you're graphing. You need that plus or minus. And then you add 3. So this is your equation. This is the inverse of the original function. And if you were to plot both of those, say on Desmos or something like that, they would look very similar. You'd have some quadratic function, and then you'd have a sideways quadratic function. And let's do another example here. So absolute values, I don't think you've done a whole lot of practice with this, so I wanted to show you specifically an example of this to help you with this. So y equals 1 over the absolute value of x minus 5 plus 2. So first step, switch the x and the y. I'm going to subtract 2 onto the other side. I'm going to take the we're going to take the inverse. By inverse, I mean flipping the fractions, different than taking the inverse of the equation. So the inverse meaning both sides of the equation to the power of -1. So like this, I just flip the fractions. Now here comes the tricky part. With absolute value, it basically takes whatever is in the bracket and makes it positive. So in order to get rid of this, we actually need to look at two cases. The first one, I'm going to take if inside that absolute value, I'm going to make a negative. The second one, I'm going to take that absolute value and make it positive. So this is how I'm going to get rid of that. And this is a common theme for that. So you just take the absolute values, get rid of it. You've got two cases, one where the bracket is negative, one where the bracket's positive. And then you solve for both of these. So for case one, I'm going to expand the negative sign inside. I'm going to add the y to both sides to get this equation, and then subtract the fraction. And this is what we're left with. So this is one of the equations. Let's look at case 2. So expanding the positive into the bracket, pretty straightforward. And then you just add 5 onto the fraction there. So these are my two equations. Yes, you can have two equations. Just like last time we had the plus or minus, that gives us two equations. This one does as well. So if you remember way back into section 1.0, when we talked about taking something that was not a function and splitting it so that I make two functions, well, here's the evidence of that. This function is split into two functions. When I combine these, I'm going to get a non-function, meaning if you do a vertical line test, it's going to fail. So this is where that comes from. We've got one more slide here about mapping an inverse. Suppose we've got the point Mn on the original graph f of x. We want to know where's it going to be on this equation. So first things first with this, let's figure out what all of the transformations are. So we've got a vertical expansion by 4. We've got an inverse here. This is what the inverse looks like to the power of -1. We've got horizontal expansion by 2. Horizontal translation by 3 to the right, and vertical translation 7 up. And then the ordering, we're going to do the inverse first. The inverse is always first. And then the same rule applies as previous sections. So either you do the verticals first, or you do the horizontals first. So this one, you know me, I do verticals first, and then horizontal. And again, note, you'll always put inverse first. So this is the last caveat with ordering. Inverse first, and then you deal with the rest of this. So now let's apply these to our original point in the order. So first is the inverse, switch m and n. So we get this. Then you do your vertical expansion by 4. Then you do your vertical translation 7 up. And then you're going to expand the x by 2. And you're going to add 3 onto that horizontal translation. So here is your final point with all of those expansions there. So that's inverses. That's the end of this unit, end of chapter 1. So be sure to finish this out. This is important for you to get this all figured out, and I will see you in class. Okay, by now you know the deal. This is my purgatory as a YouTuber and who's going to eventually become famous, and it's simply because I'm nagging you constantly to do the following. It's really easy. There's a few steps. Step 1, you gotta like the video. Step 2, subscribe if you haven't subscribed. And then question 3, just watch the videos as many times and as many ways as you want so that you fully understand it by watching it more and more. That last point, I'm joking a bit. You don't have to watch it as many times. Surprise, surprise, I'm not expecting to become a huge YouTuber. Yes, this is confession, but if you watch it a bunch of times, I'm totally okay with that. It gets my my views up there.